As we navigate the tumultuous waters of international relations, we understand that countries today exist in a narrative web driven by actions, reactions, and the oscillation of global circumstances. The United States, a central player on this global stage, forms a powerful narrative influenced by its leadership choices, strategic decisions, and the underpinning ethical values. Our analysis begins by exploring the theoretical underpinnings of U.S. diplomatic relations based on the principles of coexistence and reinforcement. Understanding coexistence as an interplay of three intrinsic principles gives us a vital framework. U.S. leadership flashes its diplomatic prowess authored on proactive decision-making, resilient alliances, and the maintenance of international order. Guiding these strategic endeavors is a firm moral conviction, which sets the tone for its global influence. Leadership inspires and depends on strategic and responsible action, shaping the U.S.'s military support for Israel. Rather than a purely force-driven approach, this principle prioritizes peace and regional stability, serving as a protective shield for its allies against aggression. Each of these principles requires and embodies moral authority. This anchors a nation's foreign policy on a solid ethical bedrock, insisting on aligning every decision with the values of justice, human dignity, and human rights, regardless of the scale or impact of the actions. In a world thriving on balance and harmonious coexistence, these principles often intertwine to create a model of diplomatic interaction. When fully active, they sow the seeds of a prosperous international political environment, characterized by trust, peace, and stability. And thus we find ourselves on the precipice, leaving the equilibrium of peace and dipping toes into the churning waters of international crisis. And while the intoxication of power might sway some, our story advances with a sobering anticipation, shining a light on the convoluted dance of coexistence, reinforcement, and their eventual denouement. In international law, the principles of the jus ad bellum, the law on the use of force, specifically prohibit the use of violent force by states except in response to an armed attack, Article 51 of the UN Charter, or with authorization from the United Nations Security Council. However, the situation becomes more complex when the actors involved are non-state entities like Hamas. Hamas is not a state but a political organization with a well-armed military wing which controls the Gaza Strip. Here we see a blurring of the lines between internal law enforcement, the right of a state to maintain order within its borders, and the international laws of war. The key distinction lies in the character and scale of the violence involved. Attacks must not be expected to cause excessive civilian damage or loss compared to the anticipated military advantage, the principle of proportionality. On any humanitarian standards, Israel's heavy bombing of areas populated by civilians and attempts to deny the entire population of Gaza access to water, food, or electricity is more than unlawful. With tens of thousands of dead Palestinian women and children, it is clear that escalation is leading to the mass murder of the Palestinian population, and so it is with a strongly critical eye that we must examine the choices that brought us to this juncture. Stepping into the volatile scene, we witness the U.S.'s firm endorsement of Israel's actions against Hamas, an endorsement issued without much heed to the international laws of war or humanitarian concerns, thereby sparking the deterioration of U.S. leadership. In the face of evident violations of international law, the U.S.'s failure to cast bolder checks or hold Israel accountable exposes a significant weakness in its leadership, shaking the foundational values that once anchored its global standing. Bringing our focus to Israel's military action, we see its double-edged nature. While stating the intent of targeting terrorist bases and protecting national security, it regularly bombs densely populated civilian areas. The extensive loss of civilian lives and destruction of civilian property cannot be considered inadvertent and negates Israel's claims about its stated strategies and objectives. The intentional tipping of the scales towards aggression and reactionary violence tarnishes its justifications of these actions as strategic and responsible, further underlining the negation of ethical military action. Last, as we unravel the consequences of this conflict, the moral authority that both the U.S. and Israel previously held evaporates. As both nations continue to throw their weight behind aggressive political and military strategies, they fail to uphold the moral rectitude that originally defined their engagement with international relations. The neglected considerations of justice, human rights, and respect for civilian life during conflict charts a course for devastating symphony of desolation, ruination, and repudiation by the rest of the world. As this narrative unfurls, we are faced with the grim reality of a refugee camp bombed on Christmas Eve. In an act that egregiously breaches all norms of humanitarian law, the world watches helplessly as hundreds of innocent lives are extinguished under the crush of violent force. It is in the sickening aftermath of this act that the principle of feedback comes into harsh relief. By backing such a brutal and indiscriminate act, the U.S.'s leadership fails to meet the necessary standards of responsibility and restraint. Women, men, and children seeking refuge from violence become victims of the very violence from which they were fleeing. The stark contrast between the claim of eliminating terrorism and the reality of mass civilian casualties sheds a disconcerting light on the dark chasm between words and actions. Here, instead of protecting innocent lives, ineffective leadership fuels the cycle of violence. This cataclysmic shift spills over into what had been framed as the strategic and responsible military action. The destruction of a densely populated refugee camp is anything but proportional or strategic. The decision drastically pushes on the pendulum of war, turning a defensive act into a symbol of merciless brutality and aggression. Israel's military action brutally shatters civilian lives under the pretext of national security, thereby completely negating its framed intentions. Can you, watching the rubble and ruin caused by the bombing, reconcile it with righteousness? The disjunction becomes increasingly stark as the reality of the wanton destruction overshadows any claim to moral legitimacy. The fallen rubble, burnt bodies, and a traumatized population that bore witness to the horrifying events on a holy night scream louder than any hollow claims of justice. As the international community grapples to make sense of this crisis, we find ourselves on the precipice of consequences of the largely unchecked trajectory of U.S. leadership, Israeli military action, and their eroding moral authority. With the inescapable visuals of camp after camp, hospital after hospital, child after child blown apart and destroyed and etched in global memory, the harsh realities of conflict are thrust into the limelight. The global community, once reliable allies and supporters of both nations, find themselves reassessing their diplomatic stances, disassociating with U.S.'s authority and questioning Israel's military action. As events spiral out of policy control rooms and into war fields, international community grows increasingly displeased and alarmed by the U.S. conduct, eroding global trust in its leadership. What was previously seen as firm, assertive leadership is now revealed as misguided, disproportionate response in support of Israeli aggression. Consequently, as international and domestic pressure mounts, both nations impulsively resort to further military aggression, ignoring global calls for restraint and ceasefire. The rising toll on civilian lives and infrastructures amplifies the crisis, leading to a more substantial re-examination of Israeli-U.S. conduct and their disregard for international law and humanitarian concerns. The cascading impacts expose the decaying moral authority of both countries. The ruthless reprisals and unabashed endorsement of such actions run contrary to their proclaimed moral standards, ripping apart the veil of morality they had adorned. Now we are further pulled into a dark vortex. The world is held captive by a relentless negative feedback loop, and the U.S. and Israel spiral from failure in leadership to intensifying military aggression to diminished moral authority, each failure amplifying the others. These failures suggest a devastating reality, a new norm dominated by human rights abuses and violent conflict. The U.S. narrative subtly but persistently shifts from the promotion of peace and stability to a blatant abuse of power. There is a clear deficit in effective leadership from the U.S. The one-sided stance and the lack of neutral mediation efforts suggest a conflicted interest, leaving global stakeholders disillusioned. The ostensibly supportive actions appear more as a desperate attempt to sustain control over an increasingly volatile region than a well-thought strategy for conflict resolution. And where leadership fails, military dominance steps in. The disparaging extent of violence meted out by the Israeli armed forces and the growing hostility from Hamas are directly contradictory to the supposed strategic objectives of peace and stability. The continuous offensive action and retaliation only fuels the cycle of violence, resulting in untold suffering and despair for the affected population. Increased military aggression backed by the disoriented U.S. leadership intensifies the calamity inflicted upon valiant civilians in Gaza. The persistent neglect of their basic human rights and the violence meted further undermines the moral authority. The disproportionate firepower aimed at civilian areas lays bare a stark reality the world cannot help but acknowledge. The complete dissociation between the leadership, military action, and moral authority lays bare a reality that no one is prepared for. The continued violation of humanitarian laws, destruction of Palestinian territories, and blatant disregard for civilian lives leads to even more profound loss of moral authority. These questions demand answers of our leaders on how they can support acts that blatantly violate humanitarian decency. A thoughtful and caring response by Bibi Netanyahu could have significantly altered the course, but he chose to focus on a military response. Joe Biden could have harnessed its influence to urge restraint, strategic de-escalation, and adherence to international laws of warfare. Anthony Blinken could have suggested that Israel target Hamas fighters who videotaped their crimes so they could be hunted down the way Israel chose to so many times before. But like Putin, the leaders of these two countries saw human lives they were meant to protect as an evil to be destroyed. What would the father say? The beast would be proud.